What's the best example of FU money you've seen? Story 1. Billionaire Howard Hughes reserved the top 2 floors of the Desert Inn in Las Vegas for 10 days. When his 10 days were up, the hotel asked him to check out. He wasn't ready to leave, so he bought the hotel and stayed there for 4 years. Story 2. I'm an employment and contract attorney. In my younger days, I was corp counsel for a large hospital. We were in the midst of a fundraising campaign and were a few million from our goal. Got a call from a wealthy, youngish guy. Offered to cover the remainder plus 10% with 2 stipulations. He used to work at the hospital when he was younger and made it rich with a medical device company he started. So he wanted a voting member board seat, and he wanted to fire this vice president who was his supervisor when he worked there and had made his life miserable. He was the reason he quit and eventually into business for himself. Took it to the board and CEO. They agreed to the board seat. I couldn't advise them to allow the firing for liability purposes. However, the CEO decided to reorganize certain departments, and coincidentally, this VP's position was eliminated. The new board member chaired the committee that made the call on the reorganization and informed the VP of the changes. That was the biggest FU long-term grudge I ever saw. Story 3. Ferruccio Lamborghini. Back in the days, he got rich building tractors, and he bought himself a Ferrari because he's Italian, and it was the thing to do when you became successful. Unfortunately, sports car clutches back then were crap and failed often. He went to Ferrari himself and said he could fix the problem, and was told to go back to his tractors because he knew nothing about high-performance cars. The wiki says he made cars to compete with Ferrari and the others, but in reality, he did it to spite Ferrari, starting a car factory to spite someone. Epic level of FU. Story 4. This is more of a you should reconsider rather than a proper FU. Growing up, our neighbor was incredibly wealthy, probably in the low 9 figures, owned a tremendous amount of land, and could probably influence the price of beef with the amount of cattle he had, and oil, of course. He was in his 80s, health was deteriorating, so his kids showed up while he was recovering from surgery and explained to him they didn't want him driving anymore and took his truck. Soon as they left, he called a local dealership and had a brand new truck dropped off an hour later. Kids came back over the next day and he just told them he decided he wanted to keep driving and was fine buying another new truck every day if he had to. Story 5. I worked at a high-end resort some time ago. We spent weeks preparing for some guests who'd booked up half the resort for him and his family, doing a bunch of renovations and changes in the cabins and rooms because the guy was very picky, but he was spending a lot, so whatever. We even rebuilt the motor on another boat and outfitted it for downrigging because they needed 3 fishing boats. The guy shows up for his reservation, and the first thing he does is start cussing out and belittling the girl at the front desk. The owner walked in to see what his problem was, and the guy proceeded to shit on the front desk girl to him. So the owner just said, "I'm terribly sorry you feel that way. We will give you a full return on your deposit so you can find somewhere better to stay." The guy's face goes white, and he starts apologizing and pleading with him, but the owner didn't care. The guy had to go out to the parking lot and explain to his entire family how his garbage temper fucked up their 1-week vacation, and they'd have to find somewhere else to stay. The owner couldn't give a damn how much extra money he had spent. He wasn't taking that shit, and more importantly, he wasn't going to make the staff take that shift. He wasn't my favorite boss, but that is something I respect. Story 6. Not a case of genuine FU money, but a lesser situation that sticks out in my mind. So, this happened to a close friend quite some time ago. He and his wife were looking for a decent home in a particular area, something to grow into and raise a family. Didn't ever find what they were looking for, so they bought a nice-sized parcel of rural land after doing a shit ton of homework and built a home on it. They were self-made. They paid cash for it all, owned it lock, stock, and barrel. They built it up over the years, so it wasn't all at once. They also were a bit eclectic and liked to work on different art projects. Eventually had a couple of workshop garages, liked to paint the place different contrasting colors, had a garden out front, etc. Not ugly, but it wouldn't be considered normal. It was pretty out of the way at the time, so no real big deal. Practically no neighbors, very minimal zoning/permit laws. That's one of the reasons they chose that land plot in the first place. Fast forward 25 some years, the entire area is becoming developed. Their kids are grown up and moved out. A massive housing development now circles their property, like a big old lopsided U-shape, nearly surrounding it. And they started to get harassed by the development owners, as well as their HOA representatives plus lawyers. Story 7. This story's lore grows with every retelling, but it's one of my favorites from growing up. There was a restaurant outside my small town. A billionaire was eating there without showing his status whatsoever at all. He asked for fries on the side of his meal instead of mashed potatoes. The waitress made a big deal about how the place didn't do substitutions. He politely pointed out that they had French fries on their menu, so he wasn't sure what the issue was. She reiterated that mashed potatoes was the assigned side for his meal and they wouldn't switch it. He escalated to a manager who said fries were no problem. That probably would have been the end of it, but the waitress wouldn't let it go, haranguing him throughout the meal, doing the thing where you talk loudly about someone within earshot of them, really talking to them, just generally being obnoxious for no reason, making a big deal of nothing. So he quietly bought the restaurant for twice what it was worth, allowing the owners to retire early and fired this woman. Story 8. Kerry Packer. He frequented a particular casino often. One night after a good run, he wanted to tip the dealer. She declined as per casino policy. So he asked to see her supervisor, who affirmed that it was against company policy for employees to accept tips from clientele. He demanded that they fire her or he'd never come back. They obliged. He then said, "Well, now she's not an employee, I can tip her," and gave her a ridiculous sum of money. The supervisor obliged. Kerry then said, "Hire her back again or I'll never come back to your casino." She got her job back and pocketed the tip. Story 9A. Former boss of mine was going through a contentious divorce. Her husband had skipped town down to Florida with some skank, ditching my boss and their son. Eventually, when the divorce was being finalized, it came to the point where they had to divide assets. She was the primary breadwinner, and the judge ruled that she had to either give him one of her vehicles, she had several large trucks, or buy him a new one. Her husband was no small fry. He stood 6 feet 7 inches tall and was a former bodybuilder. So rather than give her one of her many trucks, she bought him a completely brand new Toyota Prius. This huge man looked like he was driving a clown car around town, and it was hilarious. Story 10. My ex worked at a very expensive, very private golf course. One day, a few members are playing poker in the lounge for $5 to $10 a hand, and in walks this hotshot new member who asks to play. When he hears what they're playing for, he says something along the lines of, "What's the point of that? We're all rich, let's play for real money." Nobody's really interested in this, they just want to play for fun, but the guy won't drop it. Finally, the oldest of the group says, "Okay, let's play. What's your net worth?" To which the younger guy smugly replies, $2 million. The older guy goes, "All right, let's play the next hand for 2 mil, straight up." The younger guy gets all huffy, saying he just wanted to have fun. Why is the old guy being such a dick? Old guy responds, "I'm worth 30 mil, but I don't need to be an ass to prove it. Now shut up and play or get the fuck out." The younger guy did not want to play, apparently canceled his membership a week later. Story 11. Know somebody who tried to build a giant garage in their backyard to conduct their business out of. The neighbor complained to the town planning board and managed to block construction. He bought the empty land next to the neighbor's house and donated it to Habitat for Humanity so that they'd build a house there just to piss off the neighbor. He then managed to get some tweaked plans through the planning board for his giant garage to hold his sailboat that didn't exist. Story 12. My friend's mother-in-law has a wonderful home on Cape Cod. It's not one of the huge McMansion eyesores that started showing up in nearby towns in the 1980s. It's just a very comfortable, well-designed 3-bed, 2-bath house on a hillside with lots of beautiful hand-hewn woodwork and an incredible view of the coast just a couple streets downhill. The house was built in the mid-1950s, and while there aren't many strict legal boundaries regarding what can and cannot be built, renovated, expanded, or demolished, the folks in this community have been happily coexisting so well for the past 75-plus years that you can count the number of incidents on one hand, and everyone knows who tried to do what with their house or their land. The neighbor who lived one street downhill sadly passed away during the COVID pandemic, and because his children had moved away, the property went to market and was immediately snatched up well over asking price by some Boston-based tech bro. Within a month, he'd started demolishing the retaining walls and driveway to allow access for the general contractor he'd hired to tear down the existing house, which had been meticulously cared for and looked right at home in the neighborhood, and raise a new concrete and glass monstrosity that would have completely severed the line of sight to the coast for at least 4 houses located uphill. I wasn't aware of the means available to my buddy's mother-in-law, but after a few neighbors introduced themselves to this new arrival to the area and expressed their concerns, she cut him a check for 5% above what he paid for the house. No loans, no remortgage on her existing home, no payment plan. Just bought it outright for more than I'll earn in the next 25 years even if I'm lucky. The downhill house is now rented well below market value to a lovely family with 2 kids. Story 13. I once had a client who was a builder going through a hard time. It was 2020. The guy's clients stopped paying. Credit lines locked up, etc. During the hard time, a cabinet supplier stole his money. It was all the money the guy had at the time to finish a project, and he gave it to a cabinet supplier who basically took it and never delivered the product and said fuck off. Fast forward 2 years. Builder is doing great. Cabinet guy is not. Cabinet guy has a house he'd been working on through the pandemic and it never got finished. City flagged it for violations and wanted it either completed or torn down. Cabinet guy spent like a year in court trying to work it out with the city. Builder backdoor goes to the city and says, condemn it and revoke the permits or take it by eminent domain and I'll buy it from you. And the city did. Builder bought it from the city and stripped the house clean of every item that was removable and gave it to all the people who had gotten ripped off by the cabinet guy. Then he tore it down. He hired a taco truck that was owned by the cabinet guy's brother to supply the demolition trades with food the day of the demo. I heard he threw the guy's kid's playset in the backyard through a wood chipper. He asked me if he would get in trouble for mailing the little piece of concrete with the guy's kid's handprints in it back to him, and I said no. He left the little block of concrete with my receptionist on his way out and said FedEx this to that piece of shit for me and put it on my bill. And that was the last we heard from him. All in all, I think he spent $900K to acquire it and tear it down. I'm a lawyer for context, helping with the deal. The guy went full tilt, but if I'm being honest, I kind of admired him for it. But spending $900K just to fuck someone over that stole $50K from you is what I'd consider FU money. Story 14. I met a dude in rehab who was so rich that after a group, he flew the rest of us across state lines on a jet. He was just ready to go and took us skydiving and got us back home before our sober living curfew. When we landed at that other airport, the instructors already knew and had our parachutes and gear laying out, ready to get everyone prepared, like he just told them, yo, me and 10 friends gonna skydive in a few hours, be ready for us. He did this all on a whim too that day, lol. Some of the people totally had warrants and were not supposed to travel at all, especially across state lines, so the house manager was not happy. That dude was a homie. Some of the other people totally tried to abuse his generosity, but I genuinely just liked that dude. He tried to buy me dinner, but I refused to not pay my half, because he was just so freaking generous and caring. I felt bad. Sad he was going through shit because he was so nice and generous with his money. I went to his giant-ass expensive Orange County mansion with him too, and he made me the best steak I've ever had in my life. Hope he's doing well. Story 15. We have a disabled daughter and we're able to put her through a private preschool for free, in exchange for helping speak at the good things the school did for our daughter. We were speakers at their big charity ball and got placed at a rich table where everyone ate our story up. We were pretty poor at the time and were literally putting the fancy rolls in my wife's purse. We got to the auction portion of the night, and one of the ladies told us that last year she won the auction for an all-expense-paid first-class luxury safari down in Africa. But she had no one to go with her, so she donated it back to the school this year. Halfway through the bidding of the safari she donated, after paying for it, she goes, oh, my niece, she loves animals, I could have taken her, and went and won it again. She bid $15K that night, and she said about $12K to win it the first time, and that was 20 years ago. We went home and used those rolls to spruce up our Carl Buttig crappy deli meat sandwiches for the next week. Story 16. I knew a guy who owned a machine shop, factory next to an industrial complex I managed. I met him when I was on site at about 6 a.m., and he was walking through the gates. He was dressed like a homeless man, and told me he used to use our gates as a shortcut to get to his factory. He would wander through and then slip through a hole in the fence to access his factory because he couldn't be bothered walking around. Anyway, got talking and it turned out he lived in the area, which at this time was a pretty rough area, full of industrial land and some rough residential areas because his family used to own all the land around when it was farmland and had gradually sold it off, but he stayed in the family home. Short version, he was a very wealthy man, he was mad as a cut snake, but pretty canny and seriously rich. He told me the story that he had neighbors who had moved in and were parking their cars on his driveway. He asked them to stop, but they didn't. He knew they were renting, so he bought the house and evicted them. Story 17. This is from my own personal experience. My wife is a doctor and was in a successful practice with another doctor for 25 years. For that entire time, my wife was on top of the finances in the business, making sure insurance reimbursements were correct, negotiating insurance contracts, getting deals on vaccines, and dealing with the employees. Her partner knew nothing about that stuff and just let her handle it all. A few years ago, he brought his wife into work in the office over my wife's objections. The wife would do shady shit like take patients off my wife's schedule and put them on her husband's schedule, which impacted my wife's income. After COVID, my wife was just done with it all, and I told her we had few money if she wanted to leave. She told her partner she was leaving at the end of the year, gave him a month's notice, and said she would help him with the insurance reimbursements and everything until he got the hang of it. He told her no, not to come back at all, that he would handle it and didn't need her help. 7 months later, the practice closed down because he was incompetent. He turned a practice that made 7 figures a year into dust in just a few months. I love that story. Asshole. Story 18. About 20 years ago, I worked the flight line at a FBO, basically a place at the airport where private planes park and get service, etc. I worked at a more upscale FBO, so we mostly handled citations, Gulfstreams, and the like, private jets. One day, a customer who was repeatedly described to me as the Prince of Saudi Arabia came in on his personal DC-10. This thing was huge and complicated compared to most of our customers, in part because it was a special head of a state with FU money tricked out DC-10. Among other things visible from the exterior was a full suite of military countermeasures, missile jammers, chaff, flares, and several others I couldn't identify. He was only scheduled to be there a few days. On his planned departure date, he rolls up with an entourage in Bentleys, steps out, then before boarding says, "I want to go shopping." The entourage packs up and fucks off, just like that. Days go by, then a week, then 2. Management raises their daily cost for parking considerably, charging thousands a day, but the prince doesn't care. Day in and day out, we stare at this billionaire's plane sitting there, telling each other our theories about what was inside. A month goes by. Then one day, all hands on deck, the prince wants to leave. Tonight, we have to prepare a DC-10 with full amenities in just a few hours. We were scrambling, getting her fueled up, running through checks, servicing the shitters, etc. When the catering folks needed a hand, we all volunteered to help so we could get a look at the inside of the plane. I enter, and on my left is the cockpit. Behind the cockpit is an armored security room that looks like something from Crimson Tide. A bunch of screens with radar, cameras, controls for all the fancy military toys, etc. I turn right, and the walkway is a narrow corridor, which walks past the prince's private room. Behind the private room was a lounge with a coffee bar, couches, lots of artwork, and gold trim. Further back was a more traditional airline cabin with business class-sized seats for about 30 to 40 staffers. I'll never forget what I saw when I looked into the prince's private room. It was like something out of a Judd Apatow movie, like it was a parody of itself. In the center was a king-sized bed covered with satin sheets and a tiger fur blanket. The ceiling above the bed was, I shit you not, a mirror. The room was dimly lit in warm red and orange tones with opulent plush furniture and expensive-looking decorations. To cap it all off was a portrait of the prince in a military uniform hanging directly over the bed. So yeah, there are private jets and then FU money jets. Story 19. I'm a structural engineer. I was working on a rich guy's house, and he asked me for ideas to make his main staircase stand out a little more. But at that point, the project had gone on way too long and basically just needed to end. So I pulled out a few pictures of this ridiculous feature staircase I designed for a hotel and told him it would probably cost $100K, which is like double, if not triple, but I was trying to scare him off, and probably wasn't worth it, but that he could get the same look cladding the regular one we'd already designed for him. The mofo thought about it for 10 seconds and said, "I love it, do it." I thought I was highballing him so hard that he'd give up and move on. After I told the architect, he laughed at me and told me like 5 other things in the house that were going to be unnecessarily customized just to stand out. Custom lighting fixtures, one-off in-between sizes and colors. This guy apparently was willing to spend $1 million just to have random stuff exactly the way he wanted it. Story 20. My boss is ultra wealthy. Dude lives up the hill from Dr. Dre and was friends, neighbors with Tom Brady, among other people. One of his neighbors is T-Pain. Story was shared that T-Pain moved into the house and didn't like the facade, so he was paying to have it removed and changed to something else. Common for mansions where you want to change the appearance without replacing the whole thing. Anyway, the workers spend quite some time removing the facade when T-Pain decides that, no, he did actually kind of like it. So he paid them to rebuild it exactly as it had been. There were other stories, like my boss having a Super Bowl party and them having to bring the animals inside, like the camel, alligator, etc. And apparently, this ruined his expensive wood floors, and he didn't even blink at having to spend $30K to replace them. There's definitely a different reality when you have that sort of money, but I still really like my boss. Extremely nice, driven, and the single most charismatic person I've ever met. It's easy to see how he became wealthy.